Hello everybody, this is Michael Hollands once again for Sound of the Movies. Today I have the pleasure to be joined by Oscar and Grammy winner Anne Dudley. Anne not only became a founding member of the avant-garde group The Art of Noise, but she has worked with an incredible group of artists such as Tom Jones, Elton John, Phil Collins, the Pet Shop Boys, Seal, Cher, Paul McCartney, Frankie Goes To Hollywood, ABC, Jeff Beck, Rod Stewart, Robbie Williams, and many more. On top of that, she has scored films such as American History X, The Full Monty, The Hustle, Night Moves, The Crying Game, Elle, Benedetta, and many more. On today's episode, we will discuss some of her career highlights and also cover her album called Crossing the Bar. It is my pleasure to welcome Anne Dudley.
Thank you for having me.
It's great to have you on my show, and thank you so very much for taking the time out of your schedule. And I know we cannot cover everything. There is basically too much to talk about, but of course I would like to talk about the beginnings of your career and how you transitioned into becoming one of the most successful women composers out there. And of course you also won the Academy Award 24 years ago for The Full Monty. There have been 4 women composers so far to receive that honor. And I would like to talk about the beginnings of your career and also the trials and tribulations you may have faced at the beginning or throughout your career. What can you tell me about that, if I may ask?
Yeah, sure. Well, I never really intended to be a composer. I didn't study composition at college. I studied piano and clarinet and did harmony and counterpoint, sort of conventional music education. But I'd always been interested in playing jazz, and I played a bit of jazz piano and I did a bit of improvising. So, and when I left college, I was very lucky to meet an up-and-coming producer by the name of Trevor Horn, who was looking for a keyboard player, and because he was starting to do his productions, and I was lucky enough again to work with him on some of the big hit records that he made in the 80s with groups like ABC and Dollar and quite a lot of those records, Malcolm McLaren. And then the group of us who were working with Trevor, the team in the studio, formed a group called The Art of Noise. And again, we were never really intending to be a conventional pop group. We we were not very fashionable looking. We were not interested in funny haircuts and brightly colored clothes. And we used to release photos of weird abstract things like spanners and cliffs and things. But actually, against all the odds, we had a few hit records. And a lot of filmmakers in the advertising world and in the promo world started to use our music in their films. That they liked it because it seemed like cutting edge, avant-garde. And it wasn't long before we got a commission as a group to start writing original music for adverts and for films. And that was really, ironically, how it started. I mean, weirdly, I know a lot of people nowadays study film music and they do courses in specifically film music. And I never did anything like that. I just sort of learned it as I went along. So that slightly unconventional path into writing film music was how I began.
Great. And you just mentioned the courses, and of course nowadays so many different, let's say, forms of education which are now available, which were not available back then. So I think that's an advantage in today's world. But I've heard so many people talking to me and say, well, it's so much harder today to have a big break versus back then. Would you second that?
Yes, it is, because there's so many more people want to be into film music. And it's hard to have an original voice. And filmmakers, they're always looking for something new, for something original. And they're quite often now going to people who have a background in different sorts of music. There's a lot of pop musicians involved in film soundtracks now. So I know it must be very frustrating if this is your career path and you really are sort of concentrating on this one career path. But I say to people, it's good to have some other string to your bow, to have something that makes you stand out from other people, makes you more original. So, find your own voice, form your own group, get together your own group of musicians, do something because there's just, it's very hard to make a start otherwise.
Yes. And of course, you just mentioned to find your own voice. I mean, I've heard people comment, well, today music tends to be somewhat interchangeable. There isn't enough, or there are not enough new, fresh voices. Producers tend to want the same thing over and over again because they feel comfortable with a certain, let's say, genre of music, a certain sound of music. So, but you have covered so much throughout your career. I mean, you've been tremendously successful within the film music world. You have been an arranger, you've orchestrated music, you have worked with people such as Seal, Robbie Williams, Tom Jones, you've worked with Trevor Horn, so that covers a lot of ground throughout your career. So do you have any tip for up-and-coming composers as to what it takes to really make it in this business? Resilience, patience, anything that comes to mind.
All of those things. Especially resilience, because it's tough, and also adaptability. You can't think that what you've written is the best thing ever and perfect, because there comes that moment when you have to play it to other people and they might have a completely different view of it. And always listen to what they say, because directors and producers are not always articulate they're not musicians, they're not very articulate in musical language, but they're seeing it from their point of view, and you have to take on board what they say. Even if you disagree with it, you have to take it on board, and you have to be prepared to throw out your perfect cue and start again and take it another way. And I've done that loads of times, and most times what I do the second or third or fourth time, it's an improvement. It's a journey, but it's very difficult to get it right the first time round.
Great. Thank you, Anne. If I may ask, what do you think was the most difficult getting it right process on a film that you can recall?
So quite a few of them have been quite tricky. I mean, actually, the full Monty was not easy. It was not an easy film to score, because the score had to do several things. But there's a lot of source music in the film. There's a lot of music that they dance to, music that they're listening to, and it's music of a certain genre. It's generally pop music from the 70s, which I suppose was the youth of the characters in the film. And the film is funny. Of course, it's a comedy, but there's an underlying poignancy to it. So the score had to pick up on those things, and had to tread this very fine line between, I didn't want to kill the comedy. On the other hand, I didn't want to be overtly comic. So I had to find a style of music that had its own character, so that the music itself would be like another character in the film. And so we tried several things before we came up with this sort of slightly reggae rhythm, slightly ska beat, certainly a strong rhythmic element to it, and an unusual group of instruments. So it didn't blend into the background, this score. It had harmonica and brass instruments, baritone sax, trumpet, and guitar. And so in a way, the sort of brass instruments, I thought sort of joined it in a way to the source music, because there was a lot of brass in those source music songs. But finding that exact right character was not an easy process. And I do think that comedy can be more difficult than drama, because it's quite easy to frighten people with scary chords, but it's not quite so easy to keep the rhythm of the comedy going.
Yes, and the Full Monty is a good example, actually. And you won the Academy Award back then, 1998. And it's a very sweet film, and I've seen it many, many times. I think it's one of my favorite British films and comedies of all time. You're right, there is source music, but there is also your score, obviously, and you had to balance quite a bit. I mean, there is the tango which you wrote for Gerald, Tom Wilkinson's character. There is a theme for Gas. It's very emotional and also character based and character driven.
Yes, I think it is more so maybe than many other films that I've done, because people say to me, "Do you write a theme for a character?" And that doesn't always work, really, because characters interact. You know, it's not a question of trying to be clever with your counterpoint of these themes. It's a question, quite often, I would rather write themes for certain emotions and certain abstract things like resilience or love or jealousy, or these themes that sort of come up in a drama a lot, rather than specific themes for characters. And that's something that I've certainly done on long-running TV things, where those sort of abstract emotions and things come up all the time, and characters come and go. So, but you're right, actually, the Full Monty probably is the most overt example of something I've written with themes for particular characters.
Yes. Well, thank you, Anne. And I think sometimes it can be really hard to figure out what's working and what needs to be changed and tweaked. When you started out and when you worked on with The Art of Noise, or I think you probably didn't reckon it would become so influential and it would stand the test of time, even 20, 30 years later. What can you tell me about the sampling technology you used back then when you formed The Art of Noise, and what made it so special and so cutting edge for that time?
Well, sampling was in its infancy, and Trevor had made a lot of money as a producer, and he had some money to spend. And he spent an extraordinarily large amount of money on this computer musical instrument, a CMI, a Fairlight CMI, which was an Australian computer, which could sample a sound, and then you could play the sound back on the keyboard in different pitches. Now, that sounds great, and in a way it was great, but there was a lot of restrictions. The sound had to be very short. I mean, really short, about less than a second and a half, because that was all it could cope with. And the quality of the sound, if you put in a sound with a lot of treble in it, it would come back very muffled. And that actually became part of the character of the sound, because although it was sort of cutting edge music, it had this rather quaint, old fashioned sort of old 78, old recording quality to it. And so with the restrictions of the Fairlight, we had to be very creative in making it sound good. And all credit to our wonderful engineer that we had in our group, Gary Langan, who just was a genius at using all the various studio gizmos and equipment to make this weird, unattractive sound brilliant. And I don't know what he did, but he used to do the most amazing. You should ask him. He used to do the most amazing, outrageous things to this, what could have been a very bad sound. And so that, I mean, it was such a different world to where we are today in sampling. But I think in a way, it was the restrictions of it, the limitations that forced us to be creative, because we had to be.
Yes, and it certainly worked out so well. I mean, it's still so popular today. I was just talking to somebody the other day about Trevor Horn and about his productions and about Frankie Goes to Hollywood and of course about ABC, which you also were a part of. And he's a huge fan of yours and also of Trevor Horn's. Pieces like Moments in Love, for instance. I mean, it's still very popular, and it has been copied, and it has been on so many samples when it comes to 80s music. So you really had something going, and it's just a wonderful product.
Yes, but if you listen carefully to Moments in Love, and it's a what you might call a ballad, really, because it's a slow track, all the individual sounds are very, very short. And that's the essence of the main track. It's all done in the sequencer on the Fairlight. The other sounds are from, I had another polyphonic synthesizer called a Memory Moog. Mm-hmm. And that's the rather nice string sound that you hear on Moments in Love. And I had it's a German synthesizer called a PPG Wave, which was a fantastic synthesizer. That only had 4 voices of polyphony, but it was a beautiful sound. It's a synthesizer that a group called Depeche Mode also had, and that's very characteristic of their early music in the 80s as well. But I was very fond of that and used it a lot at that time.
Great, thank you for elaborating on that, Anne. And before we talk about Crossing the Bar, I would like to just briefly, bring up a couple of other subjects. For instance, American History X. I just need to mention that score and that movie because I think it's a very important film. Tony Kaye directed it, and you had also worked with him on several commercials, so it's a long-standing relationship. I've just recently rewatched American History X and listened to the score, and it's still so powerful. What can you tell me about your collaboration with Tony Kaye and his approach when it comes to music and the whole, let's say, his filmmaking approach and communication with musicians, in that case you?
He's a very good director to work with because he has a very clear vision. He's also a very, very good collaborator because he has people that he's worked with for years and years and years who he trusts, and so he'll guide you in the right direction. Mm-hmm. But he's not standing over your shoulder. He's not a control freak. He'll let you get on with it, and he'll take on board ideas that you'll have, and he'll be very enthusiastic and run with them. And he talked a lot about what he was trying to do in the film and the contrast between the characters. And but then he left me to it. And I mean, it was very sad at the end of the process that he fell out badly with the producers of the film and sort of left the final editing process. So he wasn't there when we did the final mix, which I think is a great shame, actually, because I think he would have brought something magic to it. And that sort of overshadowed the reception of the film in a way. But people still say to me, that that's a very powerful film that they watch and they use it in certain courses at colleges and things. And I'm very moved by that. The Ed Norton character, he's terrifyingly articulate. That's the trouble.
The speeches and his monologues and so on. When he went to prison, he had a change of heart. His whole character changed because he then felt that he was basically wrong to begin with. And then he is released from prison. And his younger brother, played by Edward Furlong, of course, still believes he's on the right track. And then, of course, they have a big discussion and almost a falling out. And then, of course, Danny realizes he has been, wrong from the beginning. So that was an important theme of the film, to convince him that he was basically going down the wrong road.
Yes, but the question is he quite as articulate in trying to convince his brother that he was wrong, in contrast to how articulate he was when he was convinced that he was right?
Yes.
It's heartbreaking, that scene. It's a very important movie. I think that it doesn't flinch from exploring that really difficult subject.
Is it a fact that there were some post-production issues? Also, I heard that Edward Norton tried to take over control, quote unquote, because he was kind of known for messing with scripts and to forcing his opinion onto directors, and then the cut had changed and he was trying to prepare his director's cut of the movie. Is that a fact or fiction? Can you comment? You don't have to.
Well, I wasn't aware of the details of what went on, but there was a power struggle at some stage, and it became. I remember there was an instance. Yes, there was a scene which I'd been sent. Yes, I'd been sent a cut that I'd scored, and Tony came to the recording session, and the scene that I'd written the music to was not his cut. And he got very angry because he didn't think that I should have been sent that cut. And the rumor is, people say he threw an orange at the screen. Well, he threw a very tiny tangerine, a clementine at the screen. And then he left. But, it wasn't, he wasn't cross with me. It wasn't a big falling out. Because it was my fault. He just felt that things were going on behind his back that he didn't know about, which I think they were. But, I was so lucky I didn't get involved in that political side at all.
I would also like to briefly talk about Paul Verhoeven. He's one of my favorite filmmakers, and you've worked with him on 3 pictures: The Black Book, Benedetta, and Elle. When you look at his films, the films which he made in Holland back then, or when he came to Hollywood, and his first picture was RoboCop, which was scored by Basil Poledouris, and he worked with Jerry Goldsmith, on Total Recall and Basic Instinct. So music has been an integral part of his films. How would you describe his approach? And I've heard that he is so focused when it comes to, and also articulate when it comes to music, that he really has a tendency to, quote unquote, push his collaborators and composers to really get the best work out of them.
Yes, I would agree with that. One of the reasons I wanted to work with Paul was because I knew of his collaborations with Basil Poledouris and especially Jerry Goldsmith, who's one of my great heroes. And I think the score for Basic Instinct is one of those scores that sort of defined the thriller genre for years to come, and still does to an extent. And Paul is, in fact, very, very cultured, very knowledgeable about music. And when we first met, we talked a lot about our favorite 20th century composers. He doesn't just know about film music, he knows about a lot of classical music. And his wife actually is a violinist, and she used to teach chamber music at the University of California. And so music is much part of their world. And he's very specific sometimes about musical references. And he'll sometimes direct me to just a passage in a classical work, maybe a string quartet by Bartók or somebody, or Shostakovich, and he'll say, I really like the harmonies of these bars, or I really like the way the strings, the voicing of the strings, or the sound of the orchestra. And that's always a very interesting and productive part of our collaboration, which is usually before before I've even started on the score. And for Benedetta, we had a lot of references to Hildegard de Bingen, the medieval composer and abbess, who was one of the first composers whose music that we know, because she was one of the first to actually write it down. And we used some of her actual melodies and themes in Benedetta. He's just really lovely to work with and a delightful man, and I love him dearly, and I hope he has many more films that he's going to make, and I hope he asks me to score them for him.
I was just going to ask you whether or not you will be joining him for his upcoming projects.
I hope so. I really hope so.
And I find it thrilling and also fulfilling to realize that there are still directors out there that really appreciate the power of music. There has been a trend of, just wallpapering something and just, going for the obvious and play it safe and so on. I don't know if you would agree with that. It's great to have somebody like Paul Verhoeven, and I've just, rewatched those 3 films which you worked on with him. If I were to compare those scores and those movies to other current projects, music-wise and emotion-wise, it's like night and day, if you know what I mean.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I think one of the things that I don't like about a lot of modern movies is there's too much music. There's actually, it never stops. And that is that's when it starts to become wallpaper, because it's there all the time. It becomes part of the sound design. And by definition, you want it to be athematic. You don't want it to be too prominent and to draw too much attention to itself. So it might have beautiful sort of sounds to it, but there's there seems to be a reluctance sometimes to have anything that resembles a theme or a melody. Music can do more than just provide a bed, a warm sort of bed in the background. Let it speak.
Yes, yeah, and you're very right. And it's always great to have a different point of view and a different opinion. I mean, some people would say, well, directors are just not comfortable with that kind of music anymore because they feel it dates their movie, which I think, why would anybody not be interested in, having the best score? And maybe they feel it takes away from their directorial effort. I don't know. It's just...
Directors can be very hands-on in every aspect of the production, with the script, with the design, with the editing. But with music, maybe not. That's where they lose a bit of control, and that's where they feel uncomfortable.
Thank you for commenting on that. And now, of course, I would like to talk about Crossing the Bar, which is your latest album. If I am informed correctly, you started to conceptualize the album during the pandemic when it first hit us. Is that right?
Yes, I was at home more, like we all were, and my piano was quite old and kept going out of tune, and I was playing the piano quite a lot because I had a bit more time. And I thought, well, it's about time I got a better piano. And so I changed the piano, and I got a much newer piano, and a slightly larger piano. Grand piano took up incredible amount of room in my studio, but I absolutely loved it, and I spent hours playing it. And I thought, well, maybe I should do something which is very personal, very small scale, reflection of me, reflection of my particular musical influences, maybe a bit English pastoral, folk music. I haven't done a lot of folk music, but I love it. A little bit of electronic, bit of minimal stuff, some melodies, just a small scale album of my own personal, some impressions, if you like. And I played some of the pieces that I was working on to my lovely publisher friends at BMG, and they said, "Oh, this is great, finish it and make a whole album." And I brought in some string players, some wonderful string players, friends of mine. And and I like the idea of the title, Crossing the Bar, which is based on a poem by a great English poet called Tennyson.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a beautiful poem about the journey that you take from life to death. And he describes it as crossing over a sandbar from the harbour to the sea. And he sees it as a very peaceful process. So the title track, Crossing the Bar, is like the gentle rocking of the sea and the flowing of the waves and everything. But I also sort of liked it because, as you've been alluding to, in my career, I try and resist being pigeonholed in any one particular genre. And I'm always trying to cross the genres, cross the bar, if you like. And also there's a musical reference, music is in bars. So once I had the title, I thought, well, yes, I'm intrigued. I should continue and release this album. So that's why this album is now out.
And there are 12 pieces on the album, and I would reckon there is a story behind each piece. One of the tracks is called The Snow Dances, so I would assume it was written during the winter season, and snowfall and the season itself inspired this piece.
Yes, indeed. Ironically, I was doing these pieces, which they're not film tracks, they're not cues to a film, but one particular day it suddenly got very, very cold and snow started falling out the window. And I was looking out the window and I was sitting at the piano looking out the window, and great big flakes of snow were coming down. And it reminded me, there's a beautiful piece by Debussy called Snow Dances. It was one of the first pieces that that wonderful Japanese composer and keyboard player Tomita did on Moog synthesizer.
Mm-hmm.
Beautiful, beautiful sound, Snow Dances. I that was the starting point musically, slight inspiration for it. And my snow dances are very irregular. It's in 5/4. So they weren't doing any sort of formal dance. It was quite a free form dance. And what's been quite fun actually is with my husband Roger, we've been making videos for all these tracks on YouTube with various elements that we've picked from various places. So there's a visual element as well if you want to have a look at them on YouTube.
Yeah, I did actually, and it's very interesting to have a backstory regarding each piece, and I would encourage everyone to check out that. The concept of the album is very interesting because I feel that most of the tracks and pieces have a different feel. There's the Snow Dances, there is Frozen for instance, Things I Left Unsaid. It offers a lot, and it's a very great concept album.
Yes, I suppose, as you say, it's impressions, if you like.
Yes.
They're pieces that might have a visual stimulus or a literary stimulus or be based on folk songs, but it's just an album, It's conceived as an album, and it's not the art of noise. It's not reinventing the wheel. It's something quite personal.
It's great if you get the chance to, of course, invest a lot of yourself into an album, be it a concept album, be it a film score, because that's what it's all about, essentially. You react to something, you react to visuals or to something which is going on outside during, the fall, during the winter. So I think that's a great inspiration to have.
Yeah, and I think nature, whether it be the weather or the great outdoors, is a great inspiration, certainly to me. I think to most people, we all need a touch of nature.
And is there anything else you would like to add or discuss regarding your career or the current state of film music or anything that comes to mind before we wrap up?
I think we've covered quite a lot of ground, haven't we? And
Mm-hmm.
I just, I look forward to what I think the interesting thing about film music is we're still finding a way to do it. It's a young art. It's only really sound and film. How long has that been going on for? 100 years?
Mm-hmm.
And so what they did then isn't what we do now. And if you look at films in the 40s, the way they use score is completely different to what we do now. And
Absolutely.
so it's continuing to evolve, and it will do so. And I think so it's a very interesting genre to be involved in, because you never know what's around the corner. There's no rules, and that makes it a really interesting and vibrant form of art. And I hope to be involved in it for many years from now.
And I would like to thank you so very much for taking the time out of your schedule to chat with me today. It was a real pleasure, and I hope you enjoyed the conversation as well.
Thank you. I did. Thank you very much indeed. And I hope everything goes well.